March 17, 1945, 14:22 hours, 15,000 feet over Bavaria. Captain Frank Richards died at 14:18. William watched the contrails twist as his flight leader's Mustang rolled inverted and tumbled through the cloud deck below. 4 years of combat experience, 32 confirmed kills, gone in 11 seconds. That killed him was already climbing back to altitude, black exhaust trailing from its BMW radial. Was 22 years old. He had flown 4 combat missions. His hands gripped the control stick so tightly his knuckles showed white through his flight gloves. His breath fogged the inside of his canopy in short, irregular bursts. The radio erupted with German voices, controllers identifying his position. American, alone, Sector 43, altitude 15,000. His head snapped left, then right. Contrails materialized above him. He counted them. 10. 5 109s. 5 190s. They were forming a coordinated net, ground controllers vectoring them into intercept positions with the precision of a training exercise. 8 minutes later, German radios went silent. The controllers demanded explanations. The fighters reported negative contact. The rookie had vanished. This is what happens when desperation becomes smarter than experience. William had arrived at the 357th Fighter Group just 3 weeks earlier. Fresh from stateside training, he carried 290 hours of total flight time. 60 of those hours were in the P-51. The rest had been trainers, basic fighters, aircraft that forgave mistakes. The Mustang did not forgive mistakes. His instructors had drilled the fundamentals into him with repetition that bordered on obsession. Energy management, situational awareness, the geometry of pursuit curves. But there was a gap between classroom theory and combat reality that no amount of training could bridge. The veterans tried to prepare him. They told him what the manuals left out. How to recognize the glint of a canopy in sunlight before you saw the aircraft. How to clear your tail in a 3-second rhythm that became automatic. How to know when altitude was more valuable than speed. How to read a sky crowded with contrails and calculate survival angles in seconds. Had listened. He had asked questions. He had flown his first 4 missions with the intensity of someone who understood he was learning a craft where mistakes were final. His squadron mates had begun to trust him. He stayed in formation. He followed orders. He did not panic when flak appeared. But trust in combat was earned in increments, and 4 missions was barely a down payment. The mission briefing that morning had been routine in tone, ominous in detail. Bomber escort to Donau, a Luftwaffe airfield complex near the Austrian border. 16 P-51 Mustangs from the 357th Fighter Group, climbing through Italian dawn into the Alpine cloud systems that dominated southern Germany in March. Had joined the formation in the pre-dawn darkness, his Mustang fueled and armed, drop tanks slung beneath each wing. The briefing officer had been direct about the risks. The Luftwaffe was concentrating its remaining strength in this sector. Jet bases, supply depots, the final infrastructure of a regime in collapse. They were protecting it with everything they had left. Fuel was rationed, pilots were undertrained. But on certain days, when the weather broke and the bombers came, the Germans still rose in coordinated swarms. The formation had crossed into Bavaria at 18,000 feet, breaking through the cloud deck into brilliant sunlight. Below them, the overcast stretched to every horizon. Above, the sky was sharp and cold and empty. The bomber stream droned ahead, B-24 Liberators in tight combat boxes trailing white contrails like chalk lines. Captain Richards led the flight, 4 Mustangs in loose finger-4 formation. He was the kind of pilot the replacement pipeline no longer produced. A veteran who had survived 3 years of air combat over Europe by being better than good and luckier than most. He flew with an economy of motion that made it look easy. At 14:17 the call came, bandits high, 11 o'clock. Richard spotted them first. Of 190s diving out of the sun, he called the break. The formation scattered. Followed his leader into a hard left turn, the G-forces pressing him into his seat, the horizon tilting vertical. They came through fast, guns flashing. Richards rolled to meet them. tried to follow. In the confusion of the merge, he lost sight of his leader for 3 seconds. When he found him again, Richard's Mustang was trailing smoke, rolling inverted, falling. Was alone. The German radio traffic changed character immediately. The fighters that had scattered in the initial attack were reforming. Ground controllers were issuing vectors. Rudimentary German, learned from intelligence briefings and overheard radio chatter, was enough to understand the essentials. They had spotted him. They were organizing a hunt. He scanned the sky. Contrails were forming in a wide arc high and to his north. He counted them again, 10 distinct trails. They were not attacking individually. They were coordinating, moving into blocking positions, cutting off escape routes back toward Italy. Straining had covered this scenario in theory. When outnumbered and alone, disengage, run, use speed and altitude to create separation, head for friendly territory. The problem was that every veteran German pilot in Bavaria knew that doctrine as well as he did. They were already positioning to intercept his most logical escape route. He looked at his instruments. Fuel, 320 gallons. Speed, 280 miles per hour. Altitude, 14,500 feet. The cloud deck below him was at 12,000. If he dove into it, he would be blind. But if he stayed above it, he was visible to every fighter and radar station in southern Germany. The contrails were tightening, 5 fighters swinging wide to the east, 5 more holding high to the west. They were setting up a pincer, high-low, classic Luftwaffe tactics. Drive the target down, then trap him against the terrain or the clouds. Made a decision that everything he had been taught. He pushed the stick forward and dove into the clouds. The world turned gray. Visibility dropped to 0. He was flying on instruments now, trusting the artificial horizon, the altimeter, the compass. The Mustang shuddered as it punched through layers of turbulent air. Ice formed on the leading edges of his wings, a thin white crust that grew thicker with each second. His training screamed warnings. Ice loading changes flight characteristics. Stall speed increases. Control authority decreases. Every instructor had emphasized the danger, but staying above the clouds meant death by coordination. The Germans had numbers. They had experience. They had ground controllers directing them like chess pieces. Had one advantage: desperation unencumbered by doctrine. His airspeed climbed, 320 miles per hour, 350, 400. The Mustang was designed for this, a diving predator built around the most reliable engine in the war. The built Merlin roared smoothly, pulling him down through 10,000 feet, 9,000, 8,000. The airframe vibrated, not rough, just alive, responsive. He could feel the aircraft communicating through the stick, through the rudder pedals, through the seat. This was what the P-51 was built to do, high-speed flight at altitude. The German fighters pursuing him were good at many things, but sustained high-speed dives were not among them. At 7,000 feet, he leveled off inside the cloud deck. The gray was absolute, no visual reference, no horizon, just the instruments and the sound of the engine. He turned northeast, deeper into Germany, away from Italy. It was the opposite of what any trained pilot would do. It was the opposite of what the Germans would expect. Above him, the radio chatter intensified. The German controllers were confused. They had lost radar contact. The fighters reported negative visual. They were searching the southern quadrants, the logical escape routes back toward Allied territory. Flew northeast for 6 minutes, compass heading 045 degrees, maintaining 7,000 feet. Then he turned north, then northwest. He was no longer running in a straight line. He was threading through the clouds like a mouse in tall grass, changing direction every few minutes, making himself unpredictable. The German fighters were burning fuel searching for him in the wrong sectors. The first break in the clouds came at 1431, a gap in the overcast, maybe 2 miles wide. Saw it ahead and pulled back on the stick, climbing to stay inside the gray. But not before he glimpsed what was below. Mountains, the northern edge of the Alps, ridges and valleys cutting through the landscape in parallel lines, terrain that would hide him from radar, terrain that would force the German fighters to search visually. He descended to 5,000 feet, just above the ridge tops. The clouds were breaking up here, fragmented into layers and patches. He could see the ground intermittently, forests, snow on the higher peaks, a narrow valley running east-west. The radio crackled, German voices closer now. They had picked up his general position, not exact but close enough. He heard the frustration in their transmissions. Sector 62. Nothing, he must be here. The German controllers were vectoring fighters in a search pattern. Could hear the tactical adjustments in their transmissions. They were dividing the search area into grids, assigning sectors, coordinating sweeps. Professional, methodical, exactly what he would have expected from veteran pilots with ground radar support. But they were searching in the wrong direction. They were searching the valleys, expecting him to use the terrain for cover. Which he was, but he was also doing something they did not expect. He was heading toward them. This violated every principle of fighter tactics. When outnumbered, you created distance. You used speed to open the engagement envelope. You ran for friendly territory where the odds might improve. You did not fly deeper into enemy airspace, where every minute increased the chance of interception, but was betting that experienced German pilots would not expect suicidal behavior from an American rookie. They would assume he was following doctrine. They would position their search pattern accordingly. Every time the German controllers vectored fighters to intercept his projected course, he was already past them, flying deeper into their coverage area instead of trying to break out of it. The fighters were chasing a target that refused to run in predictable patterns. At 14:38 he saw them. Two 109s 1,000 feet above him, silhouetted against a patch of blue sky. They were searching, noses swinging left and right, but they were looking south. They were looking behind him. Was already ahead of their search line. He dropped lower, skimming the ridge tops at 300 feet, using the terrain to break line of sight. The valley narrowed. He followed it, the Mustang's wings nearly brushing the pine trees on either side. The German fighters above him never saw him pass beneath them. At 14:42, the radio traffic changed again. The German controllers were pulling the fighters back, caught fragments of the transmission, fuel critical, abort, return to base. They were calling off the hunt. Not because they had lost him, but because they could not afford to chase him any deeper into their own territory. They were too far from their bases. Fuel was too precious. And the target, this lone American pilot who should have been easy prey, had led them on a chase that burned fuel they could not spare. The voices faded, the contrails turned away. Was alone again, but this time the sky was empty. He turned south. The Alps rose ahead of him, white peaks cutting through scattered clouds. Beyond them, Italy, safety, home. His fuel gauge read 82 gallons, enough, barely. He did the math in his head. Distance to approximately 180 miles. Fuel consumption at cruise power, roughly 45 gallons per hour. Flight time at current airspeed, just under 50 minutes. The numbers worked, but only if he encountered no headwinds, no need for combat power, no deviations from a direct course. The margin for error was measured in minutes. He climbed to 10,000 feet and set course for. The engine ran smoothly. The cockpit was cold. His hands ached from gripping the stick. He realized he had been holding his breath and forced himself to breathe normally. 37 minutes. That was how long he had been alone. The Germans had hunted him for 31 of those minutes. In fighter combat, that was an eternity. Landed at 16:05 hours. Fuel remaining, 22 gallons. The crew chief met him on the and asked if he had seen Captain Richards. Shook his head. The intelligence officer debriefed him for 3 hours, recounted the mission in detail. The attack, the separation, the dive into clouds, the flight northeast into enemy territory, the low-level run through the valleys. The German radio calls he had intercepted. The intelligence officer stopped him there. You understood the radio calls? Enough, said. They called off the pursuit. Yes, sir. Why? Hesitated. I think they thought I was leading them into a trap. I was flying the wrong direction. Experienced pilots don't run deeper into enemy airspace. They assumed I knew something they didn't. The intelligence officer made notes. You used their assumptions against them. I didn't plan it that way, sir. I just ran where they weren't looking. The debrief was typed, classified, and circulated to every fighter squadron in the 15th Air Force within 48 hours. It was designated Case Study 17B, Evasion through Counterintuitive Routing. The tactical principles were extracted and, when outnumbered and isolated, conventional escape routes become kill zones. Enemies anticipate standard doctrine. Survival requires doing what the enemy considers impossible or irrational, running toward enemy territory, using weather as concealment, maintaining unpredictable headings, exploiting terrain below radar coverage. Speed without direction is visible. Direction without speed is vulnerable. Combining both in patterns the enemy cannot predict creates the gap needed to survive. William flew 43 more missions before VE Day. He never saw combat again that matched the intensity of March 17th. But the lessons from that day, his 37 minutes alone over Bavaria, became part of the institutional knowledge of American fighter aviation. Training manuals written in the years after the war included his tactics. Fighter pilots in Korea faced MiG-15s using evasion principles refined from debriefs like his. Vietnam-era pilots learned that predictability was more dangerous than enemy firepower. The doctrine evolved, but the core insight remained. When surrounded, when outnumbered, when the odds are mathematically impossible, survival is not about fighting harder. It is about thinking differently. Desperation, properly applied, defeats experience. Proved it over the mountains of southern Germany. 1 rookie pilot, 10 veteran hunters, 31 minutes of pursuit. The Germans had better pilots, better coordination, better tactics. But they were hunting a target who refused to behave like a target. And that made all the difference.